After rising tensions in United Kingdom's Parliament, Boris Johnson resigns. Hello, you're welcome to International News Desk on Echo Television Africa. I am Lois Dureki. We begin tonight with Boris Johnson, United Kingdom Prime Minister, agrees to resign. Over North Korea cases, South Korea opens probe against former spy chiefs. Surging prices plunged 71 million into poverty since Ukraine war. Australia gives fourth COVID shot as subvariants took a new wave. And Sri Lanka's central bank increases interest rates to 21-year high. In London, United Kingdom, Boris Johnson has resigned as the United Kingdom's Prime Minister on July 7th after his newest political crisis following the resignation of major ministers and other officials. He said he will stay on as a caretaker Prime Minister until someone chosen by his party replaces him. The surge of resignations began on Tuesday despite Johnson's apology for not realizing that Chris Pincher, a former minister in charge of pastoral care, was unfitting for a job in government after complaints of sexual misconduct were made against him. Pincher stepped down as deputy chief whip last week following claims that he grabbed two men at a private members club, but Johnson was told about allegations against him as far back as 2019. Those who resigned over the scandal said they lost confidence in Johnson's ability to govern in the national interest. The final crisis came just weeks after Johnson survived a no-confidence vote in early June from his own Conservative Party members of Parliament by 211 votes to 148. Johnson's leadership has come under strong scrutiny after an investigator's report in May criticized the culture of rule-breaking inside the Prime Minister's office in a scandal known as Partygate. Reports describe the alcohol-fueled bashes held by Downing Street staff members in 2020 and 2021 when coronavirus pandemic restrictions prevented United Kingdom residents from socializing or even visiting dying relatives. Johnson, 58, has spent months fighting to maintain his hold on power after the controversy saw him becoming the first serving UK Prime Minister found to have broken the law. Now, prosecutors in South Korea have launched investigations into the conduct of two ex-spies chiefs who have been accused of abuse of power in cases connected to North Korea during the administration of former President Moon Jae-in. On Thursday, the pronouncement came a day after the South Korean National Intelligence Service (NIS) filed criminal complaints against the agency's former directors Park Ji-woon and Soo-un. The NIS accused Park, who headed the agency from 2020 until May 2022, of destroying critical intelligence documents associated to the September 2020 shooting death of an unarmed employee of South Korea's Fishery Ministry by North Korea's Coast Guard. The case triggered a public uproar when it was discovered that the North Koreans set the employee's body on fire in an attempt to cover his death. The Moon administration claimed the employee was killed near the two countries' Yellow Sea border while trying to defect to North Korea at the time, but the South Korean Coast Guard dismissed those claims in June, citing a lack of evidence. In a second complaint, the NIS said Soo, who headed the agency for 2017 to 2020, shut down an investigation into two North Korean fishers who wanted to defect to South Korea in 2019 and were quickly deported back to their country. The case was uncommon as the two men were accused of killing 16 co-workers on board their fishing vessel, but they did not stand trial for their crime, and their extradition to North Korea meant almost certain execution. The case reportedly strikes the first time in South Korea's history that defectors had been rejected and forcibly deported, according to reports. A Moon official defined the pair as atrocious criminals who had confessed to the murders and could do potential damage to South Korean society. During the investigation, Soo allegedly cut down the typical investigation time into a defector's case from 15 to 30 days to less than a week. South Korean prosecutors said on Thursday that they will be investigating the cases separately, but their findings could damage Moon's reputation. Kim Sung-soo, a policy advisor to Transparency International Korea, said the allegations are likely to inflame partisan divisions in South Korea, where attitudes toward North Korea often spilled along ideological lines. Approximately 71 million people worldwide are facing poverty due to surging food and energy prices driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Development Programme UNDP has warned in a new report. On Thursday, the UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner said at the launch of the report that an analysis of 159 developing countries showed that the rise in vital commodity prices this year was already hitting parts of Africa, the Balkans, Asia and elsewhere hard. The 20-page report focused on addressing the cost of living crisis in developing countries. It estimated that 51.6 million more people fell into poverty in the first 3 months after the war, living off $1.90 a day or less. This pushed the total number globally as this threshold to 9% of the world's population. An additional 20 million people slipped to the poverty line of $3.20 a day. The war in Ukraine has brutally interrupted global markets for food and energy due to both countries' large global market shares. Before the war began on February 24th, Russia was the world's largest and second biggest exporter of natural gas and crude oil. Russia and Ukraine together accounted for almost a quarter of global wheat exports, 14% of corn exports, and more than half of sunflower oil exports. Ukraine's blocked ports and incapability to export grains to low-income countries further drove up prices, pushing tens of millions into poverty and economic crisis. The UNDP report said over two-thirds of the 166.8% rise in natural gas over the past 12-month period ending on 31st May 2022 has been recorded since the start of the war. Among those countries likely facing high poverty impacts across all poverty lines are Armenia and Uzbekistan in the Caspian Basin, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda and Sudan in Africa, Haiti in Latin America, and Pakistan and Sri Lanka in South Asia, it noted. The economic woes are surging protests in many countries as they are battled to meet their debt repayment obligations. More than half of the world's poorest countries are in debt distress or at high risk of it, according to the United Nations. Moving forward, Australia says it will start giving a fourth dose of COVID-19 vaccines from next week to people aged 30 years and above. On Thursday, the announcement came as hospital admissions across the country spike caused by the highly transmissible new Omicron subvariants BA.4 and BA.5. The new subvariants have now become the main coronavirus strains in many countries, with pandemic experts warning they could lead to more hospitalizations and deaths because they spread more quickly than other coronavirus variants. New South Wales, Australia's most populous state, warned it was experiencing a new wave of infections driven by the BA.4 and BA.5 subvariants. Meanwhile, Victoria said these have become the dominant strains in the state. The pandemic is not over. We are entering a third wave that is placing enormous pressure on our health and hospital system, Health Minister Mark Butler said, according to reports. About 4,000 people are currently in hospitals in Australia suffering from COVID-19. The biggest count since early February, authorities said, when the country endured its previous significant Omicron outbreak. The changes will make over 7 million people eligible for their second booster shot. The second booster dose was so far restricted to people above 65 or with any serious illness. After largely containing the virus through tough border restrictions and snap lockdowns earlier in the pandemic, Australia began living with the virus late last year through a staggered easing of curbs after higher vaccinations. On business and economy, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, CBSL, has raised borrowing costs to attack record high domestic inflation and to contain any build-up of underlying demand. On Thursday, the standing lending facility rate was raised by a full percentage point or 100 basis points to 15.5%, while the standing deposit facility rate rose by the same amount to 14.5%, the highest in 21 years. The decision comes as inflation touched a record 54.6% this year-on-year in June, while food inflation accelerated to 80.1%. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe told Parliament Tuesday that the inflation rate will hit 60% in the coming months amid rising commodity prices and a declining currency. The policy adjustment will help guide inflation expectations to be anchored around the targeted 4 to 6% level over the medium term and curtail any buildup of underlying demand pressures in the economy, it said. The island of 22 million people is dropping under stark foreign exchange shortage that has it battling to pay for vital imports of fuel, fertilizers, food and medicines. Prior to Thursday's decision, the country's central bank had raised interest rate by 850 basis points since the beginning of the year, even as its economy contracted in the first quarter, marking the beginning of a painful and long recession for the country. Economic activity has also come to a grinding halt as the bankrupt nation asks residents to stay home until July 10th to conserve fuel. There has been substantial progress made in the negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for a credit facility, while negotiations are on with bilateral and multilateral partners to secure bridge financing, the CBSL said. Bond yields shot up on Wednesday on the expectations of about a 500 basis points increase. But what is interesting is the central bank is anchoring its decision on Sri Lanka seeing disinflation in the second quarter of 2023, said Udishan Jonas, chief strategist at equity research from CAL, referring to a slowdown in the rate of increase of prices of goods and services. And more story says Joe Biden fights to describe agenda ahead of visit to Saudi Arabia. With the war in Ukraine leading to a rise in petrol prices in the United States and around the world, oil production will top U.S. President Joe Biden's agenda when he visits Saudi Arabia later this month. However, Biden and his highest aides have shied away from acknowledging the global energy crisis is driving the visit. Instead, they have cited an array of issues from normalizing ties with Israel to ending the war in Yemen, dealing with Iran, addressing climate change, and developing counter-terrorism strategies. Experts have said this demonstrates Biden's reluctance to engage with Gulf Kingdom amid human rights concerns, as well as his administration's efforts to fend off criticism from lawmakers in Washington. Indeed, while many members of Biden's Democratic Party are skeptical of deepening ties with Riyadh, there is nearly unanimous consensus in Washington favoring expanding normalization between Israel and Arab countries. Russia's Lavrov at G20 Summit said to be dominated by Ukraine war. Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, has flown into Indonesia's resort island of Bali for a meeting of foreign ministers of countries from the group of G20, which is fixed to be overshadowed by tensions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The summit will see the first face-to-face meeting between Russia's top diplomat and some of his biggest critics since the war began on February 24th. The G20 includes Western countries that have accused Russia of war crimes in Ukraine and imposed sanctions, but also countries such as China, Indonesia, India and South Africa have been more muted in their response. There was tight security in Bali's Nusa Dua area on Thursday, where the summit is being held, as foreign diplomats descended on the island for the meeting. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi shakes hands with his Indonesian counterpart Retno Marsudi during their bilateral meeting ahead of the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Nusa Dua, Bali. Speaking before her arrival, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said Russia must not allowed to use the G20 meeting as a platform given its war in Ukraine. Lavrov had planned to meet some G20 counterparts on the sidelines of the summit, Russian reports, but ministers including Baerbock and United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken have ruled out meeting Lavrov. Some officials from Europe and the United States have stressed the Bali summit will not be business as usual, with a spokesperson for the German. Still on the news, United Nations report cautions that world going backwards on eradicating hunger and malnutrition. The number of people affected by hunger globally surged to as many as 828 million in 2021, a rise of approximately 46 million since 2020 and 150 million since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to a new United Nations report that provides fresh evidence that the world is moving further away from its goal of ending hunger, food insecurity and malnutrition in all its forms by 2030. The 2022 edition of the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World SOFI report presents updates on the food security and nutrition situation around the world, including the latest estimates of the cost and affordability of a healthy diet. It also examines ways governments can repurpose their current support to agriculture to help make healthy and nutritious food cheaper, mindful of the limited public resources available in many parts of the world. The report is a joint publication by the Food and Agriculture Organization FAO, the International Fund for Agricultural Development IFAD, the United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF, the United Nations World Food Programme WFP, and the World Health Organization WHO, and here are some of the findings being revealed. Around 2.3 billion people in the world, 29.3%, were moderately or severely food insecure in 2021, 350 million more compared to before the outbreak of the pandemic. Nearly 924 million people faced food insecurity at severe levels, an increase of 207 million in 2 years. The gender gap in food insecurity continued to rise. In 2021, 3.19% of women in the world were moderately or severely food insecure compared to 27.6% of men, a gap of more than 4 percentage points compared with 3 percentage points in 2020. Almost 3.1 billion people could not afford a healthy diet in 2020, up 112 million from 2019, reflecting the effects of inflation in consumer food prices stemming from the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures put in place to contain it. An estimated 45 million children under the age of 5 were suffering from wasting, the deadliest form of malnutrition, which increases children's risk of death by up to 12 times. Another 149 million children under the age of 5 had stunted growth and development due to a chronic lack of essential nutrients in their diet, while 39 million were overweight. In the shores of Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda settles to reduce tensions at a mini-summit in Luanda. The Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda have settled a de-escalation process following week of increasing tensions over rebel fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, the Congolese president said Wednesday after mediated talks. But the talks mediator, Angolan President João Lourenço, went further, announcing a ceasefire, although giving no details. Violence has spread between the Congolese army and the M23 rebels and is ongoing. The DRC has continually accused Rwanda of supporting the M23, a charge the small Central African country always denied. I am pleased to announce that we have had positive results in our view, in that we have agreed on a ceasefire among other measures, Lourenço said in remarks at the end of the mini-summit attended by Rwanda's Paul Kagame and Congo's Felix Tshisekedi in the Angolan capital, Luanda. Tshisekedi's office said a roadmap had been established towards normalizing diplomatic ties, including through ending hostilities involving the M23 militia in eastern DRC. The declaration came after day-long talks which the Rwandan state broadcaster reported had concluded with an agreement upon roadmap to de-escalate hostilities. But the Rwanda Broadcasting Agency stressed that it was agreed that the issue of M23 be dealt with domestically within the framework of the Nairobi process. A mostly Congolese Tutsi rebel group, the M23 or March 23rd movement, first leaped to prominence when it briefly captured the eastern Congolese city of Goma in 2012 before it was driven out in a joint UN-Congolese offensive. After lying mostly dormant for years, the M23 resumed fighting last November after accusing the Congolese government of failing to honor an agreement to incorporate its fighters into the army. Fierce fighting has seen the rebels make significant advances in Eastern Congo. Last month, M23 fighters captured the strategic town of Bunagana on the Congolese-Ugandan border, for example. This involves setting up a joint DRC Rwanda committee, which is due to hold its first meeting in Rwanda on July 12th, as well as a roadmap for normalizing relations. And finally, Beninese citizens feel unsafe in the face of heightened terrorism. Benin's government has been taking measures to stop invasions after so many months of terrorist attacks in the northwest and northeast of the country. Despite this, citizens still feel insecure. Jihadists first struck Poga in the Penjari National Park area in December 2021, where 2 soldiers and an assailant lost their lives. Following this, the government set up a military base in the north of the country targeted at reinforcing the security of goods and people. But the attacks continued with the storming of the Monsi and the Sari police stations and other localities in the north, causing loss of life both among armed forces and civilians. The authorities continue to reassure the people of Benin the Beninese army is sufficiently equipped to ward off all the scourges that can disturb the tranquility of the Beninese. Alain Fortunen Nautin, Beninese Minister of Defense, said, "I will tell the people of Benin that they have nothing to fear." General Fortex Babadi, Chief of General Staff of the Beninese Armed Forces, reinforced the message, "We are going to make it so that every time someone tries to tackle Benin, that they feel it deep in their spinal cord," he said. But the president of a consumer association in Benin, Robin Akrombensi, believes the move to counter the jihadist attacks has left the average Beninese with the impression that his freedom of movement has been restricted. Benin has long been one of the more stable countries in West Africa, where Islamic State and Al-Qaeda militants threaten Sahel countries, although criminal smuggling gangs also operate along its frontier. A major reminder: Boris Johnson, United Kingdom's Prime Minister, agrees to resign. Over North Korea cases, South Korea opens probe against former spy chiefs. Surging prices plunged 71 million into poverty since Ukraine war. Australia gives 4th COVID shot as subvariants took a new wave. And Sri Lanka's central bank increases interest rates to 21-year high. That's you up to date with international news stories. See you next time and have a good evening.